Hello, welcome to week 8. I thought last week was week 8. Oh no, it was week 8. Now we're on week 9. Perfect, okay. That means I have the wrong slides up. Wow, I was so not ready. Give me one moment. Anyway, hi, welcome to week 9. Today we're going to go over the Bureaucracy, which has less slides than last week, but I think will take a little bit more explanation. And admittedly is like the most boring of the sections, just because there's a lot of bits and pieces. It's kind of complicated. There's a lot going on. But we'll get through it. No big deal. Couple things. First thing is, I'll touch on that in a second. This week, right on Friday, you have your movie assignment due. It is the movie Spotlight. That's the movie that everyone voted on. You can find it. Where can you find it at? Give me 1 second. Excuse me. On all of these streaming sites, if for some reason you cannot access it or you don't have these, this is like probably your last chance to let me know. It would be amazing and great if you didn't tell me on Friday, mainly because the assignment is due on Friday. But either way, we'll figure it out. Also, with that being said, I don't know what like the rating of the movie is, but either way, like I've been saying for the last couple of weeks now, this could be uncomfortable for some of you. It is definitely a heavy topic. Here it is, like it's about journalists, but it's set against the background of trying to uncover a scandal dealing with the Catholic Church. Again, that could be controversial, that could be triggering, that could be personal for some of you. So if you have any issues with that, no big deal, no problem, right? Our voting was pretty split, so just email me and let me know, and you can do a different movie, no big deal. I'd prefer if you let me know, again, by Thursday, because, like, Thursday is not going to give you a whole ton of time to do it anyway. But that being said, I hope that you are able to contact me before then. If not, and you plan to watch this movie, I hope that you enjoy it. I think it's a pretty good movie. They classify it as thriller and crime, but I think it's much more about the media, and how the journalists are working, how the system is working to uncover this, and specifically focusing on like how long this takes to uncover, because they won't publish anything without this like obvious trail, without this evidence, basically. The media is not supposed to, and in this movie cannot just go out and make these allegations and say whatever they want and talk about people's lives without having the means and the resources and the evidence to do so. So that's really what I want you to focus on during this movie. But yeah, again, issues with streaming, let me know. Issues with the content of the movie, also let me know. Obviously, you had your exam 2s on Friday, which they weren't that bad. They really weren't that bad. They definitely, I think, could have been better, considering since the exam's over, I'm just going to tell you now, like, the quizzes that I gave you, the little practice thing, I actually had all of the questions on the quiz, or on the exam. There were added questions, like I did add more questions to the practice that weren't on the exam, but I actually didn't take any questions out. So that practice had every single question that was on the exam. So I feel like if you looked at that and you looked at the study guide, you did pretty well. If you didn't do either of those two things, or also you weren't watching the lectures, maybe you didn't do that well. That being said, all of your grades are still pretty good. Like, I don't have most people are still in the B-ish range. So, like, if that doesn't signify to you that these exams really are not the end of the world, they're really not the end of the world. Of course, I would prefer that you use the resources I give you, but if you choose not to do so, I can't do anything about that. That is your prerogative. Next week, we have the case study assignment. So I'm going to take a minute and go over that super quickly. Then you get a break, and then we have exam 3. Then you get a break. Then you have essay 2, which I will post. There's like little assignments I have to make, and I will post those probably this week. And then you have your final homework, which is literally just questions from the exam. Your final exam, again. I'm just going to give you questions. I'll probably end up making another quizzes for exam 3. So if you didn't do as well as you thought you would on exam 2, maybe utilize the quizzes for exam 3. The homework will literally just be the only part of the final that we hadn't touched base on yet. And I'll talk about that layout when we get a little bit closer, maybe in week 11 or something. Also, that date is wrong. Sorry. It's fine. It'll be fine. 12. I think I don't know. We'll figure that out. I'll fix that. Either way, that's what we got going on. Let me talk about the case study assignment, and then we will get into bureaucracy so we can get through stuff really quickly. Okay. So as always, content, homeworks and assignments, case briefs. And there is a Google Doc or a Word doc, and then also a PDF. They're the exact same thing. I just use both so you can access whichever one you want. This is very, very simple. So since we talked about the judicial branch last week, this is just how we're going to incorporate what this is like. You're just going to write 2 case briefs, 50 points total, so 25 points per brief. I give you a ton of sources here. Quimby, Barbary, Oyez, these are all amazing sources for these cases. They'll basically just give you most of the information that you need to know. You can fill it out however you want. So you can write it in a paragraph form, or you can do separate sections. Paragraph form would look like this. You just write it out like a paragraph. This is kind of short. If you do paragraph form, I would expect that you'd have like 2-ish paragraphs for the case. Or you can do it in section form, which will just look like this. So you'll just lay out the facts, issues. I think this is easier. I think it's easier for you. It's also easier for me to grade. But if you think better using paragraph form, then by all means use paragraph form. So you have 2 cases. One of them is everyone's doing the same case. The other one, I give you a list, and you can pick from any one of these lists. And you just literally have to give me this information. So I need the facts of the case, which is what the case is about, why the case is being brought to the court. Give me some context, like where the case started, what courts was it in before it came to the Supreme Court. That being said, these are all Supreme Court cases. So give me some content, give me the facts. Again, where it came from, what the previous decisions were, like what the case is about, basically. Tell me who is bringing the case, tell me who's challenging the case. And then you need to tell me about the issues, which the issue is just the legal question. You can think about it kind of like the research question if you were writing a research paper. It's just, what is the question that the court is trying to answer? Like, what are they measuring is legal or not legal? The holdings. So again, this is going to come from your past cases. This is going to be your precedent. Precedent is spelled wrong. I don't know why it is. And you're going to talk about the legal principle. And then you need your rationale, which is the legal reason that the Supreme Court made the decision that they made. And then the opinions. You need to have, here's the deal. You need to have a majority opinion because there will always, always, always be a majority opinion. And then you likely will need a dissenting opinion. That's also not the right. I don't know why this is messed up. I'll fix that. A dissenting opinion, DISSENTING, which in most cases, a couple of cases don't have a dissenting opinion, and that's okay. But in the cases that have them, again, it will be the case of the judges who disagree. So it'll say, we do not think this should be constitutional, or whatever it is, because of this reason. Therefore, we dissent with the majority opinion. Some of these cases also have concurring opinions. I don't think very many of them do, but if they have a concurring opinion, you need to put it in there. And I know which ones have a concurring opinion, so don't try to skirt around it. That's the assignment, basically. And again, like all the other assignments, turn it in however you want. Do it in the sections or do it in paragraph form. I give you these sources. Quimby, Barbary, and Oyez will lay it out for you exactly like this. It will tell you all of these details. So it doesn't take a whole lot of like time or critical thinking, really. You just have to find the information. So you have to do the Brown versus Board of Education case. Everyone will be doing that case. And then your second case, you can pick from any one of this list. These are all pretty important cases. Obviously, Miranda would be your Miranda rights. Loving v. Virginia is the case for interracial marriage. Roe v. Wade is obviously the like medical privacy pro-choice case. And then Dobbs v. Jackson was the case that overturned that. U.S. v. Nixon is the Watergate case. Obergefell v. Hodges is the same-sex marriage case. Mapp v. Ohio, I believe. Let me just check this real quick. Yeah, it's the one that deals with the Fourth Amendment. Marbury versus Madison, I believe, is when they extended. Yeah, this is when they extended their own power. I thought I had the banking case on here, but apparently I do not. Lochner v. New York is the one about the 14th Amendment. And then Engel v. Vitale, I think. Why can I not? There we go. Is the First Amendment prayer in schools. So a lot of these are like, I mean, obviously all of them are dealing with a amendment from the Constitution. And most of these cases are very, very controversial cases. They're cases that have had like an actual impact on your life in one way or another, or the lives of many people. Obviously, Miranda v. Arizona is like one of the biggest cases ever. It's your Miranda rights. When we were talking about how to appeal a case, if you were not read your Miranda rights, immediately that's going to go into whether or not you can appeal a case, because not being read your Miranda rights is a violation of the arrest, and that could have the case thrown out entirely, regardless of what you did. Regardless of the crime committed, if you were not read your Miranda rights, the case could possibly be thrown out, because that is like a massive violation of your citizen rights. U.S. v. Nixon obviously is the Watergate case. Like, this was huge. We didn't vote to watch the movie on the Watergate scandal, but it was one of the options. So if you'd like to watch that, feel free. But yeah, like Watergate was huge. And then obviously prayer in schools was also really big. Lochner v. New York was a pretty big case. So yeah, and also a lot of these cases built precedent. So Like, even the case from 1803, which is super old, built a lot of precedent that impacts how things are run now. Anyway, enough rambling. That is your assignment 3, which is due next Friday, November 1st. So you have your movie this week and the case study next week, and then we get a break. Feel free to ask questions, email, or Discord, whichever works for you. I'm going to get into the bureaucracy. I'm going to try to go through this super, super quickly, but like I said, there is some explaining that needs to be done. So we're going to talk about what the bureaucracy is, the evolution, organization, and roles of the bureaucracy, the politics of the bureaucracy, how the bureaucracy interacts with the federal government, and how it interacts with us. So what is bureaucracy? We hear a ton of people throw this term around all the time. What is it? It is basically when an organization or a system is characterized by a hierarchical structure, worker specializations, explicit rules, and advancement by merit. Max, some people say his name differently. I say Weber. It's probably not right, but he is a German sociologist who sets up like what the bureaucracy is, and he basically creates all of these rules that make up a bureaucracy. So what does he say? You don't need to know these years. I just put it here for context. He says that a bureaucracy needs to have these 4 very specific things. It needs to have a hierarchy, which is a clear chain of command and responsibility, right? You have like a worker, and then you have their boss, and then you have their boss, and you have the supervisor, and then you have the general manager, and it just goes up and up and up, and then at the end, usually there's like a CEO or a leader or an executive board of some kind. You also need to have specialization, which is when tasks are divided by expertise. So you oftentimes will get into the role that you get into because you are good at something. You are an expert in something. Next, there needs to be explicit rules, which govern decisions, standardization, and predictability. So these rules are laying out exactly how this is going to work every single time. And you know exactly what to expect every single time. Your day is the same every single time. And the last piece of this is merit, which is hiring based on your exams and your experience. So you need to not only be an expert and have specialization in whatever it is you're going into, but you also need to have that merit, which means you need to provide the proof of this. You oftentimes will take exams, or you'll test their knowledge, or you'll have training sessions, which is really just you providing the service, showing that you know how to do what you're doing. And you'll get hired based on that. So you need these 4 things to be a proper bureaucracy. There are 3 types of bureaucracies that we're going to talk about. The first one are government corporations, which are corporate entities established by Congress, which means Congress created them, in which the government, the federal government, holds partial or total control. AKA, it's a corporation that Congress created, and the government has some level of control over it. The USPS, our United States Postal Service, that is like the most daily example of a government corporation. The second one are non-governmental organizations. Often they're called NGOs. And these are independent agencies, completely independent, but they are funded by Congress. So the CIA, the EPA, NASA, all of these entities exist outside of government, but Congress does fund them. Or the government funds them, and Congress makes the budget. And then the last one is a regulatory commission, which is a bureaucracy that makes rules for businesses in the interest of safeguarding the public. So the Food and Drug Administration. Right? Like, there's always this talk when new vaccines come out about whether or not they have been approved by the FDA. A ton of food has little FDA approval stamps on their packaging. And all of this is, right, the FDA is doing this to make sure that the food or the drinks or the vaccines or whatever it has to be is proper or safe for human consumption or like to put into our bodies or whatever it is. And so this is guided by a regulatory commission, which is regulating. These are just a couple of traits of bureaucracies. I'm not going to go over them that much because we don't really need to spend a ton of time on them. But the key here is that they are experts in their field. The goal is to promote efficiency and effectiveness. Like, you're supposed to work quick, and that's why everyone has their very specific job that they do very specifically in the same way all the time. It's resistant to interference. It's very hard to interfere with the bureaucracy, right? Like, if you ever hear your parents talk about taxes, or if you ever hear about trying to, like, get this paperwork to go through, like trying to skip the line, all of that is due to the bureaucracy. It's very hard to break through this because it is designed for effectiveness. So you cannot skip steps. You have to go from step to step to step. Very stable. Again, there's a lot of career security and advancement because, again, there's a clear hierarchy and there's a clear way to work your way up because you're doing the same thing. And as you do more things, you gain more expertise, you gain more merit, you can do more things. You get promoted. You do the same thing, you get promoted. There's a lot of bureaucratic infighting. However, it is oftentimes necessary for a functioning government. Right? The government can't do everything. That's a very common misconception. That our politicians, that our president, that our congress members, that our lobbyists, that our staffers and the communication people, that they all know everything. Right? We're electing these people to office because they know everything. And that's just not the case. They don't know everything. That's why they have cabinets and boards and staff members and liaisons, and they have people who literally their entire job is just to read bills because they don't know everything. So in order for a government to function properly, in order for a government to do all of this regulatory things that it needs to do, and in order to have all of these bureaucracies that get our mail to our houses every day, or make sure that our food is safe to eat, or make sure that our national security is secured, like our congress members and our president, they cannot do this. Number one, there's not enough time in the day. And number two, they don't know how to do everything. That's what the bureaucracy is for. That's why bureaucrats are experts in their field. So they can do that field specifically. So in politics, what this looks like more than what I just talked about is this idea of the power of the desk, which means that they can administer and manage government every day, constantly. And they're oftentimes implementing their policy through political leadership, through having lobbyists, and through this idea that they're required, right? Like they're necessary for our daily life, for the functioning of government. And so any policy that's going to make the USPS more efficient is likely going to be easy to pass, even with all of this hyper-partisanship or whatever, because we just, like, who's gonna do the mail every day, right? Like, we just need the USPS. The issue, however, again, is that there is tons of red tape, and it's very inflexible, and there are tons of rules in order to keep everything moving step by step as it's supposed to be every single day. There's this thing called bureaucratic culture, which is basically just the values and procedures of an organization that make it even that more difficult to break into the bureaucracy, that make it that more difficult to skip a step of paperwork, or talk to a supervisor instead of like an agent. Like all of these levels that just make it difficult to move through quicker than you're supposed to. Which sounds counterintuitive, right? Because their entire goal is to be efficient and effective. And I guess I'm going to leave that up in the air for you to ponder on. Like, is the bureaucracy actually as efficient and effective as it's meant to be, as it's supposed to be, as it's designed to be? Because in order to be effective, we have to go through all of these steps that cannot be passed, which oftentimes end up taking longer the more people are involved. However, again, the government can't do everything. So we need to have some level of bureaucrats who can run the Postal Service. This idea of bureaucratic culture, though, mainly comes from these 2 points of a policy commitment or a specialization, which is both basically just that the issue of the agency is critical, right? We need the USPS, and that they know more about the policy that it would take to run the USPS because they work in it every single day. So they're specialized. Why do we need this bureaucracy? Again, I've kind of already gone over this. The primary thing is that, like, they're just so big. It's just so big. Mailing to every single person in the United States is huge. It just requires organization. Making sure that the apple you're going to eat is, like, healthy for you is very complicated. It takes a lot of time. They get distributed all over the country, and they come from dozens of places. So you need to have those checks. You just need the expertise. Because democracy is not always the best answer, right? Like, I don't know anything about the Postal Service. So why would democracy be the best way to handle the Postal Service if most people don't know anything about it? That's even more ineffective. We also have this idea of neutral competence, which is the need to depoliticize administration of government. So what this means a lot of times is, like, especially in the age of hyperpartisanship and polarization, we are constantly switching between different political parties in government, and oftentimes that comes with a lot of very specific challenges. So the bureaucracies are intended to kind of skip through that, because it's just not as effective if every 4 years or every 2 years, when a new Congress, a new House is elected, we have to switch all these people around. We have to move the bureaucracies. The Postal Service stops working for a week. That's just not effective. It's not going to get anything done. So the goal of this neutral competence is that they work for their bureaucracy. They work for their issue. Like, they are experts in the Postal Service. They know how it works, and it doesn't matter what political party is leading the government at the time. The Postal Service is going to work the exact same way. I think that's pretty explanatory, but let me know if you have questions on this idea of neutral competence and why it's important and how it works. I know this is going to be really controversial. I'm just going to say it. It's just an example. Bear with me. Anthony Fauci, who was, like, our big medical guy during COVID, he was always giving the press talks, and he was sometimes he was standing with Trump while Trump was giving the press talks during COVID. And then, like, he had been in his position for, like, the last God, I don't know, 5 or 6, 7 presidents. Like, it didn't matter what political party the president or Congress was. He was in his position because he was an expert in his field and good at his job. And that's a primary example of how that works. Regardless of the president who was leading and regardless of their political party, he kept his position because he was an expert in it. And so it didn't matter, right? The political party of the president didn't matter to the effectiveness of informing the country on these, like, massive pandemics and illnesses and viruses that were happening both in the country and around the world. We've already touched on this idea of neutral competence, so I'm going to skip over it a little bit. But the National Park Service is another great example, just like who is leading and protecting and taking care of our parks during fires and making sure the wild animals don't go extinct and, like, people aren't burning things down in our national parks. Like, it doesn't matter what president or political party is in charge. They're going to do that regardless. And it's a way of making sure that our national parks aren't politicized, that they can still work unbiasedly and effectively. The other thing that bureaucracies do is act as a rule maker, and so they use their own judgment based on their merit and their expertise and their specialization to function in their specialty. So the FCC, which regulates, like, radio, they're using their own judgment to create these rules. So, like, oh, you can't say certain words on the radio. Like, that is their own rule, and they're setting these rules based on their judgment, which is coming from their expertise, which is unbiased and effective because they're not dependent on other sources or the partisanship of a political party. The last thing they do, sorry guys, I'm like having an issue with my throat. The last thing they do is act as an adjudicator, which is to basically interpret laws and penalties and casting judgment, again, based on their specialty. So the IRS, right? Like, they're sending you your taxes and telling you if you paid enough taxes and telling you how much you still need to pay. And they're not only making their own rules, and they're not only professional and unbiased, but they're also interpreting rules from Congress, right? Like, Congress is setting our tax laws. All the IRS is doing is interpreting those laws, and they're using their expertise to understand what the law means and then interpret it however they think it should be interpreted based on, right? Like, if you make more money, you get taxed more. That's this idea. And again, they're doing it unbiasedly, neutral competence. It doesn't matter who the political party in charge is. The leader of the IRS is the leader of the IRS, and they've been doing this for God knows how many decades, and you just trust that they're good at it. Did you catch that? You just trust that they're good at it. And some people disagree, right? Some people disagree. Some people think that the IRS and Dr. Fauci and the National Park Service and the FCC, that, like, they shouldn't be doing their job and they don't have the expertise. But this idea is coming separate, most times, from the political party, right? Because that's the goal, is that they're not part of this. They are separate. Similar to how the Supreme Court, like, sure, right, they're maybe more conservative or liberal, but they are separate. They do not reflect a political party. They have ideologies, because everyone has an ideology, but they do not represent a political party. Whereas our Congress members and our president do represent a political party. So the roles. I mean, we kind of just went over this already. This is a little bit more detail, so I think I'm going to skip this for now. But this is just a further explanation of this. Now we get to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of the bureaucracy, which we already talked about a little bit when we were talking about government. So, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good of our bureaucracies is that they are committed to policy. They have their specialty, they have their expertise, they are very rule struck, which means they set their rules and they stick to them, and it's difficult to bypass them or not follow them, and if you do, there are punishments. And change is very, very slow, which means everything is predictable, you know exactly how it's going to work. Tax day is the same day every single year. You know when you get your W-2s, you know when to file your taxes. It's the same thing every time. The good or the bad of the bureaucracy is that it is very, very easy to cover up shortfalls. It's very easy to push blame. It's very inflexible, again, so it's hard to work with. And they're all constantly fighting for this need to prove that they're still effective. What I mean by all of this is like, while yes, it is good that they are following their rules and they are very hesitant to change because it makes it predictable, it is also bad in that this inflexibility doesn't oftentimes allow it to make little exceptions or to change with the times, or God forbid your W-2 gets lost or your company doesn't send it. Like, tax day is still the same day, and it's very hard to get around that. It's also easy to cover up shortfalls. So because there is a direct line of communication, right, if one person messes up, they can just push it to the person below them, who will push it to the person below them. And it's really easy to do this. And so it's very difficult not only to find, like, the root of the problem, but also to solve the problem, because we just take so much time trying to figure out what even happened that getting to solve it gets pushed back. And the last thing is the ugly, which is all of the corruption that oftentimes happens. So, like, things like the Challenger explosion caused by bureaucratic oversight, where, right, like, some engineer or whoever was working on the rocket and noticed this little, I don't actually know the details of this, but noticed this little piece was out of place, or they weren't getting the right results on whatever it was. And they reported it up, and it got reported up, and it got reported up. And by the time you get so high, right, the public pressure and the political pressure to send the Challenger, because we were, like, in the space race, and it got so far up the chain that the person who made this decision just truly didn't understand what the real issue was. We had played the game of telephone too many times. Obviously, we sent the Challenger up, and then tragedy struck. And that happens very frequently. Or not very frequently, but, like, a lot of what we think of as being, like, our tragedies or like, things that could have been avoided are very often due to bureaucratic oversight and this political pressure and this public pressure to, like, get what we need to get out. And oftentimes we end up overlooking all of these steps that need to be taken, or we end up rushing things, or the people have been so out of being an engineer for so long, they no longer have that expertise and they just make decisions. We see this happening a lot with, like, the planes. I know there was an issue earlier in the year about a ton of planes. I don't know exactly for a fact, but that could be due to bureaucratic oversight. Corporate secrets is a big one. This is just the idea that, like, people know cigarettes are bad for you, but there were all those campaigns in, like, the late 1900s that were talking about how doctors recommend cigarettes and it's so good for your health, and it just isn't. The Got Milk campaign is another one of these things. Like, we know that milk actually isn't that good for a lot of people, but but we pushed this whole campaign that everyone should drink milk and you need to have this much milk every single day. And then withholding information that could be useful. So, like, in the name of national security, oftentimes we will withhold information that could be helpful for the sake of this bureaucratic rules and control. The best example I have for this one is actually from a TV show. So if you guys have ever seen Criminal Minds, I love Criminal Minds. There is an episode where they were investigating basically a threat at like the new opening of a mall, and actually the leader of the team, Hotch, his wife, was going to be going to that mall, and it was thought to be an anthrax attack, which was obviously very, very deadly and very fatal. So it was going to be at this mall. It was a grand opening. Tons of people were going to be there. And due to, right, like, national security and, like, not letting the bad guy know that they were onto them and trying to control for every possible situation that could happen, they weren't able to tell the public, like, hey, don't go to this mall opening. So, like, they're walking into this thinking, oh, God, like, all these people are going to go to the mall opening. We might not be able to save them, and they're all going to die from anthrax. And they weren't able to tell the public this was happening, or they could risk the bad guy, the enemy, not, like, making the attack, knowing that the FBI was onto them, and then running away and just doing it somewhere else. And that's like a prime example of how sometimes the bureaucracy keeps you from doing things that maybe morally would be the right decision, but logistically and even morally might not be the right decision. And it's really up to the people who have that expertise in that bureaucracy to make those decisions. And again, you just have to trust that they're the right ones. And you can try to build that trust through this idea of neutral competence. We're going to talk about the Iron Triangle super quickly. This is just the idea that Congress and the bureaucracy and then an interest group, which we'll talk about, I think, next week or later on in the semester, are all interacting. And so Congress is doing this through funding, through electoral support. They're doing this through legislation, via lobbies. The bureaucracy is often making rules and regulation that help Congress and interest groups. And then interest groups, again, are getting electoral support or lobbying or whatever it may be to help Congress and bureaucracy. So this is just a cycle of how the three of them are helping each other. It's a mutually beneficial relationship where every group is helping the other three. This creates an unbreakable bond because everyone's helping each other. It's a symbiotic relationship. And the more you help, then the more they help, then the more you help, and it just keeps going like a cycle. The iron triangles themselves are oftentimes what is protecting this bureaucracy, even when bad things happen. And it comes from this idea of agency capture, where the agencies are becoming protective of one another. So the Department of Agriculture is very, very protective of farmers. And the farmers are very, very protective of the Department of Agriculture. And they are also very protective of the companies that are creating all of this farm equipment that they need to keep their farms running. And it's just a revolving door, right? You help me, I help you, you help me, I help you, and it keeps going. And as you do that, because you are benefiting, right, because the farmers are benefiting from the regulations of the Department of Agriculture, then oftentimes they don't want the Department of Agriculture to lose their power or to lose their funding or to lose their ability to make rules or laws, right? Like, you become protective. Because if the other piece of the triangle is doing well, then inherently you are doing well because you are protecting each other. The military-industrial complex is like the biggest in the iron triangle. And this comes from Congress, obviously. Congress itself is always the piece. And the other two are decided by whatever you're talking about. So it's Congress, and then the Department of Defense, or the Pentagon, and then your military companies, or the companies who are making your tanks and making your weapons and all of this. So here's a little graphic. These are also in, let me just stop real quick to show you this. In your content here, if you go down to additional handouts, they're all here. So you can find like the Iron Triangle handout. I thought another one was here, but maybe it's not. Either way, this handout is in the slides and also in Brightspace. So in the military-industrial complex, right, Congress is giving friendly legislation to the defense industry, which is giving support and lobbying and congressional support to the Pentagon, which is then giving to Congress really favorable orientation and decisions and actions, and they're like following the things that Congress sets out for them. So in exchange, Congress is giving money and political support to the Pentagon, who is then giving more money and profits and regulation to the defense industry, who is then lobbying for members in Congress to get elected, when they then give legislation and oversight, and then congressional lobbying, and then friendly decisions. And it just keeps going around and around and around. The oil disaster is one of the biggest failures of the Iron Triangle, or it's a failure because the Iron Triangle was working so well. So it's between, obviously, Congress, who right here is down here on this side, and then the Department of the Interior, and then all of the lobbyists who work in the oil industry, or who work for the oil CEOs. And so this Iron Triangle was running and running and running, and it was working, and it was working, and it was getting very strong. And then eventually, the regulations got so low, and the money got so high that we had the oil disaster of 2010. Because the industries were bribing regulations, so regulations were getting lower, so they were able to do more of what they wanted, so they made more money, so they put that money right back into the lobbying, and it just goes around. And then disaster happened. So sometimes the military-industrial complex is like kind of quickly getting to this point. I think, that's my personal opinion, I'm not totally sure. Or, I mean, I think that's the case, but I'm being biased. It may or may not be the case. But some other examples of the Iron Triangle are not that strong and currently haven't had like the ugly. Some are like getting there. I think the military-industrial complex is getting there. And then some have unfortunately already reached that point. The oil disaster of 2010 already reached that point where the Iron Triangle got so strong, they got so protective of each other that eventually it led to what we call the ugly, which hurt a lot of people. It hurt a lot of animals. It hurt the water. The oil industry itself even was hurt for a little while. And they're still coming back from that. This is another one, prescriptions, which I also think is very quickly approaching the ugly, where Congress is funding research to the farm companies who are then making OxyContin, and they're funding the bureaucracies and the FDA who are lessening regulations because they're getting funding. So then we're putting more drugs out and doctors are prescribing them more. People are getting addicted to them easier. And it's just another possible, this is a claim, the ugly coming, is that the iron triangle is getting so strong that eventually a lot of people will be hurt from it. And government as a whole is just a big maze of these. So as you can see, Congress is always at the center. Congress is always one of the legs or the points of the iron triangles. And Congress is a point on all of these different triangles. Agriculture, military, drugs, banking, timber, mining, oil, all of these things. I want to talk a little bit, moving gears just a bit, about how the president impacts this, because I talked a lot about how Congress impacts this. And basically, the way that this is impacted is the president oftentimes will appoint these heads and layers of departments. But again, it is still resistant to change in that a president cannot just come in and just willy-nilly take everyone out of the bureaucracies. The only time this really happens is when a person gets fired or leaves a bureaucracy on their own. Stuff like Fauci, right? He retired. Aside from speculation, aside from politics, aside from all of those things, when a new Democrat or a new Republican came into office, they did not just fire Fauci. Could they have? Probably, yeah. But they didn't. Because he had expertise and he was a fixture in the bureaucracy, and that was what he did. Now, again, this is not the best example because he did technically work for the White House, but I think this is a really good way to visualize it and see how this works. But a president can appoint heads. Also, again, right, a president signs off on the budget. So if Congress is making a budget and they give the FDA all this new funding, the president decides whether or not to sign off on that. Again, back to this point, which is the funding. And they have a lot of power of persuasion, right? So even though a president might not be able to directly or officially make any changes to the bureaucracy or make any laws regarding the bureaucracy, the president can influence the bureaucracy. And sometimes and oftentimes they will. Now, in our last couple slides, I want to talk about what this means for you and how the bureaucracy serves you. The first thing we want to touch base a little bit on is the difference between appointees and civil servants and where that issue comes in, because it impacts not only the president's influence, but also how it impacts you. So there are people who are appointed, right? And then there are people who just believe in the mission, or people who are experts in the field. And so they have conflicting agendas, right? Because if you're an appointee, oftentimes at that point, then you are working for the president or the political party because you were appointed by them. But if you're a civil servant, or you've been working in the field, or you've been working in the FDA for a really, really long time, you actually care about the mission and you have a dedication to the mission. And oftentimes this can butt heads. They also have different time frames because appointees often have short time frames, right? There is a chance, it's a small chance, but there's a chance that if a new president gets elected, you're out. You're outie 500. And so they don't really think about the mission of the bureaucracy for a long time, whereas civil servants are doing that. So what they'll do a lot of times is they'll just wait for those appointees to leave, and then they'll keep doing what they were doing. And if this is the case, if there are a lot of controversies and the bureaucracy isn't doing what the president may want them to do, sometimes the president will just start a new agency rather than trying to change the existing one, because you can't, because it's super, super difficult, because they have all these rules and regulations and hierarchies. They'll just start a new agency. This doesn't happen very often, It does happen sometimes, but I can't even think of a good example of this. So it's not common. Most times we don't see the bureaucracy falling into these kinds of problems. Sometimes they do, but most times they do not. And then you. So how does that impact you? You also have control over the bureaucracy. And this comes from a few things. First of all, there are citizen advisory councils, which are just councils made up of citizens that can overlook and advise and sit in on meetings that the bureaucracy is holding. The second option are your sunshine laws, which is that even if you're not on the advisory council, you can see when these meetings from the bureaucracy are happening. And depending on what kind of meeting it is, you can just go to it. Let's go sit in and just see what they're talking about. At the very least, you can know when they're meeting. And sometimes they'll release their minutes to the public, so you can see, like, even if you couldn't go to the meeting, you can see what they're talking about, what they decided on, what they voted on, all that kind of stuff. The third option is the Freedom of Information Act, which is that you can just get copies of agency information. Sometimes this looks like seeing who works there and how much they get paid, if it's public information. Sometimes you can see when, like, again, not only the bureaucracy as a whole, but you can see when people have meetings, leaders of the bureaucracy sometimes. You can see when the bureaucracy was founded and who their big donors are and who, like, where they get most of their funding. It's through Congress. But you can see all these things. Any information that is public knowledge, you can just have access to it because of the Freedom of Information Act. And then the last one, and this one will be on your third exam for sure. I mean, this slide is very, very important for you. Most of this will be on your exam in one way. But the Privacy Act of 1974 is also very important. And I have one question specifically about this. And it is that you have access to agency files on yourself. I don't know when you would need this. I've never needed it. But if for some reason you do, right? If you want to call up the CIA and ask about any files they have on you. No, the CIA, I think, is an extreme example. But if you want to call up the FDA and see what files they have, this sometimes can apply to, like, your land. Like, you can see if there's any files on the land that you own. You can get access to that as well. So you can see what they have on you. You can see what they're up to. You can see what they're doing. And there's a bunch of laws that allow this to happen. So you also have control over them. Just like Congress controls them through funding, and the president controls them partially through vetoes, but mainly through influence and, like, appointees. You can control them passively. You can keep up with what they're doing, watch them, and act as like a guard dog if you so chose, if you wanted to. And that is all I have on bureaucracies. So I think we got through that pretty quickly. Again, your movie assignment is this Friday. If you have questions, let me know. And then your case study is next Friday. We're going to talk about civil rights and liberties. It's like the shortest slide. It probably will take a half hour, maybe. So next week will be a super slow week. So there you go. If you have questions, thoughts, concerns, feel free to email me or send me a message on Discord. Thanks. Bye.